Sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrive disguised as the most ordinary evenings. The acrid smell of smoke and cordite hung heavy over Bermondsey as Samuel Hartwell wiped down glasses behind the scarred oak bar of the Crown and Anchor. Outside, the December wind rattled the blacked-out windows while distant air raid sirens wailed their nightly lament across war-torn London. His pub, marked with hand-painted signs reading "Colored Only," had become a sanctuary for Caribbean dock workers seeking warmth, rum, and refuge from both German bombs and English prejudice. But tonight felt different. Tonight the fog seemed thicker, the silence more pregnant with possibility. When the heavy oak door creaked open, Samuel expected another shivering dock worker. Instead, a rotund gentleman in a soggy bowler hat stumbled inside, shaking rain from his coat. The man's eyes swept the room with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to command, yet he showed no surprise at finding himself in a colored establishment. What happened next would unravel everything Samuel thought he knew about his father, his past, and his place in a war that was reshaping the world. How could this mysterious visitor know secrets that had been buried with his father 13 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's hands stilled on the glass he'd been polishing, his dark eyes studying the unexpected visitor. The gentleman's expensive overcoat dripped steadily onto the worn floorboards, forming a small puddle that caught the amber light from the pub's oil lamps. Around the room, conversations had dropped to whispers as the other patrons, mostly Jamaican and Trinidadian men still bearing the salt stains of their shifts at Surrey docks, cast curious glances at the white stranger. "Evening, sir," Samuel said, his voice carefully modulated with the broken English he'd perfected over 20 years in London. "We be closed to your sort tonight." The lie came easily. The Crown and Anchor was always closed to white customers, but Samuel had learned that phrasing it as a temporary inconvenience rather than permanent policy kept the authorities from asking uncomfortable questions. He watched for the familiar signs, the tightening around the eyes, the stiffening of shoulders, the indignant sputtering that usually preceded demands to speak with his betters. Instead, the man simply nodded and moved toward the fire crackling in the stone hearth. "Quite understandable," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of privilege. "Dreadful night to be particular about one's clientele, though. The Jerrys are making quite a show of it up near Tower Bridge." Samuel frowned. Most white Londoners wouldn't dream of acknowledging his authority over any space, yet this man spoke as if Samuel's rules were perfectly reasonable. Stranger still, he seemed genuinely unperturbed by his surroundings, settling into a chair near the fire with the ease of someone accustomed to adapting to circumstances. "You best be moving along then," Samuel continued, though something in the man's demeanor made him hesitate. "Blackfriars Station not far. You catch the last two before—" A thunderous explosion cut through his words, close enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar and send dust cascading from the ancient beams overhead. The lights flickered, and several patrons instinctively ducked. Through the blacked-out windows came the distinctive whistle of falling ordnance, followed by the sharp crack of anti-aircraft guns from the nearby docks. "Well," the stranger said mildly, settling deeper into his chair, "I believe that settles the question of my immediate departure." Samuel found himself caught between protocol and practicality. His pub had strict rules for good reason. Keeping a low profile meant survival in a city where Caribbean immigrants existed at the mercy of white tolerance. But sending anyone into the streets during an active raid, even an unwelcome visitor, violated the deeper code his father had taught him. Shelter was sacred, regardless of who sought it. "One drink," Samuel said finally, moving to the bar with practiced efficiency. "Until the all clear." "Most gracious." The man pulled a silver case from his waistcoat and selected a cigar with the deliberate movements of ritual. "Might I trouble you for a light?" Samuel struck a match, holding it steady as the stranger drew on the cigar. In the brief flare of light, he caught a clearer view of the man's face, heavy jowls, piercing blue eyes, and something indefinably familiar about the set of his jaw. But the match died before Samuel could place the resemblance, and the moment passed. "You run a fine establishment," the man continued, his gaze sweeping the pub's interior with what seemed like genuine appreciation. The Crown and Anchor was humble by any measure. Mismatched furniture, walls yellowed by years of tobacco smoke, floors worn smooth by countless boots. But Samuel had worked hard to make it welcoming. Photographs of the Caribbean islands adorned the walls, calypso music played softly from an ancient gramophone, and the bar was always stocked with the dark rum that reminded his customers of home. "Been here long?" the stranger asked. 23 years, Samuel replied, then caught himself. He'd answered automatically, without the careful grammatical errors he usually employed. Something about this man's manner invited honesty in a way that made Samuel's defenses waver. The stranger nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. "Fascinating borough, Bermondsey. Rich history. I've always found that the most interesting stories hide in the most unexpected places." Another explosion, closer this time, sent a photograph tumbling from its nail. Samuel moved to retrieve it, a faded image of his father standing beside a group of men in colonial dress, taken somewhere in Jamaica before Samuel was born. As he bent to pick up the frame, he heard the stranger's sharp intake of breath. "Remarkable," the man murmured, and when Samuel straightened, he found those piercing blue eyes fixed on the photograph with unmistakable recognition. "Absolutely remarkable. Tell me, my good man, what do you know about your father's work before he died?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd never mentioned his father to this stranger, never indicated the man in the photograph was family. The casual way the visitor spoke of death, as if it were established fact rather than assumption, sent ice through Samuel's veins. "How you know about my father?" he asked, his careful grammar slipping entirely. The stranger's smile was enigmatic, almost sad. "Because, Mr. Hartwell, your father and I were old friends." The photograph trembled in Samuel's hands as he stared at the stranger, his mind reeling. 23 years he'd lived in London, 23 years of carefully constructed identity, and now this man, this white gentleman who'd appeared from nowhere, claimed friendship with a father Samuel barely remembered. "Friends," Samuel repeated slowly, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of bombers. "You say you were friends with my father." The stranger took a long draw from his cigar, the ember casting shadows across his weathered features. "Indeed. Though I suspect he told you very little about his work in those final years." Samuel's throat tightened. His father had died when Samuel was 12, a sudden fever that took him in 3 days, or so his mother had told him. But there had always been gaps in her story, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, letters that arrived bearing official seals and disappeared before he could read them, visitors who came at odd hours and spoke in whispers. "He was a carpenter," Samuel said, though even as he spoke the words, he remembered the books hidden beneath loose floorboards, texts on mathematics and linguistics that seemed far beyond a tradesman's education. "Built furniture for the colonial houses, among other things," the stranger replied cryptically. Before Samuel could press further, the pub door swung open with a bang. Marcus Webb stumbled in, shaking rain from his coat, his broad shoulders still bearing the grime of his 14-hour shift at the Surrey docks. Behind him came Clement Price and Joseph Morgan, their faces drawn with exhaustion. "Samuel, my friend," Marcus called out in his rich Barbadian accent. "The docks be a madhouse tonight. German planes circling like vultures, and the foreman pushing us to load twice the usual cargo." He stopped short when he noticed the white stranger by the fire. "Oh, we interrupting?" "No interruption," Samuel said quickly, grateful for the familiar presence of his friends. These men had become his family over the years, dock workers and stevedores who gathered each evening to share news from home, trade stories of the old country, and find solace in each other's company. Just weathering the storm. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied the stranger, his protective instincts clearly aroused. "Bit off your usual path, aren't you, sir?" The stranger's smile remained unruffled. "The evening's events have led me rather far afield, I'm afraid." Clement moved to the bar, where Samuel mechanically began pouring the man's usual rum. This was the rhythm Samuel had built his life around, the predictable comfort of routine, the safety of knowing exactly what each evening would bring. By 6 o'clock, the day shift workers would arrive. salt-stained and weary. By 7, the younger men would start a dominoes game in the corner. By 8, someone would inevitably produce a guitar, and the room would fill with the songs of home. "Any word from your sister?" Samuel asked Clement, partly from genuine concern, but mostly to restore some normalcy to the evening. "Letter came Tuesday," Clement replied, accepting his drink with a grateful nod. "Says the sugar harvest been good this year. Asked when I might be coming home." His voice carried the weight of a question he couldn't answer. They all carried it. The constant tension between the life they'd built in London and the home that called to them across an ocean. Joseph settled into his usual chair, which Samuel noticed was pointedly positioned where he could keep an eye on the stranger. "Foreman says they need extra men tomorrow. American convoy coming in, medical supplies for the field hospitals." Samuel nodded absently, but his attention kept drifting to the photograph still clutched in his hands. In the faded sepia tones, his father stood with quiet dignity among men whose faces he'd studied countless times over the years. Who were they? Why had his father never spoken of them? And how could this stranger possibly know anything about a man who'd died in Jamaica decades ago? "Samuel?" Marcus's voice cut through his reverie. "You feeling all right, brother?" "Yes, Samuel forced himself to focus. These men depended on him, on the sanctuary he'd created within these walls. The Crown and Anchor wasn't just a pub. It was home, refuge, the one place in London where Caribbean men could exist without apology or pretense. He'd built this life carefully, brick by brick, maintaining the delicate balance that kept them all safe. But as he looked at his friends, Marcus with his dreams of bringing his wife to London, Clement counting coins to send home to his family, Joseph reading letters from a sweetheart he hadn't seen in 5 years, Samuel felt the familiar ache of questions left unanswered. Who was he, really? What had his father's life truly encompassed? And why, after all these years of careful invisibility, did he suddenly long to know the truth? The stranger's presence had shattered something fundamental about the evening's predictability. Samuel could feel the weight of secrets pressing at the edges of his carefully ordered world, threatening to expose truths he'd never dared to seek. Another explosion thundered overhead, but this time Samuel barely noticed. The all-clear siren wailed across London's battered skyline, its mournful cry signaling the end of another night's bombardment. Samuel watched his friends gather their coats with the weary efficiency of men accustomed to interrupted evenings. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. Clement pressed a shilling into his palm for the drinks, and Joseph lingered at the door with a concerned backward glance before disappearing into the December fog. Now only Samuel and the stranger remained. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross first. Samuel methodically collected empty glasses, his movements automatic while his mind churned. The photograph lay face up on the bar where he'd placed it, his father's image seeming to watch him with patient expectation. "They're good men," the stranger observed, tamping out his cigar in a brass ashtray. "Your friends, the kind who'd stand by you when troubles come." "They would," Samuel replied, then found himself adding, "but they don't know who I really am." The admission escaped before he could stop it. 23 years of careful pretense, and this man's mere presence had loosened his tongue like strong drink. Samuel felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his early days in London, when every interaction carried the potential for disaster. The stranger rose from his chair, moving to the bar with surprising grace for such a portly figure. Up close, Samuel could see the quality of his clothing, the hand-tailored cut of his waistcoat, the gold watch chain that caught the lamplight, the expensive leather of his shoes. This was a man of considerable means and influence, which made his presence in a Bermondsey pub all the more bewildering. Identity, the stranger mused, settling onto a bar stool, is a curious thing. We choose who we wish to be, then spend our lives maintaining that fiction. But blood will tell, Mr. Hartwell. Eventually, it always tells. Samuel's hands stilled on the glass he was drying. "What you really want from me?" "Direct. I appreciate that." The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, its surface worn smooth by handling. "Your father, Thomas Hartwell, didn't die of fever in Kingston as you were told. He died here, in London, in the autumn of 1924. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor in a cascade of crystal fragments. That's not possible. My mother, she told me. Your mother told you what she needed to tell you, what we asked her to tell you. The stranger's voice carried a weight of old regret. Thomas was working for His Majesty's government at the time of his death. Linguistic analysis, code-breaking, intelligence work that required absolute secrecy, even from his family. Samuel gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Everything he'd believed about his past was crumbling like London's bombed buildings. Why are you telling me this now? Because we need you. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Outside, the familiar sounds of London's post-raid recovery began. The clatter of fire engines, the shouts of wardens checking for damage, the steady tramp of boots on cobblestones. But inside the Crown and Anchor, time seemed suspended. Need me for what? The stranger opened the portfolio, revealing documents bearing official seals and photographs that made Samuel's breath catch. His father, unmistakably, but older than in any picture Samuel had ever seen, standing beside men in military uniform, pointing at maps, his intelligent eyes focused with the intensity Samuel remembered from childhood. Your father possessed a rare gift, the stranger continued, an ability to see patterns in seemingly random information, to break codes that stymied our best cryptographers. He could speak 7 languages fluently and understand the linguistic structures of a dozen more. We believe you inherited his abilities. Samuel stared at the documents, his mind reeling. I'm a pub owner. I pour drinks and keep the peace. I don't know nothing about codes or... Don't you? The stranger's eyes were sharp, penetrating. How many languages do you really speak, Samuel? And I don't mean the broken English you perform for your customers' safety. How many newspapers do you read each morning before opening the pub? What do you see when you watch the patterns of ships in the Thames, the movements of people through your neighborhood? Samuel's throat went dry. He did see patterns, had always seen them. The way dock schedules aligned with unexplained increases in German bombing runs. The subtle changes in his customers' behavior when news from home grew scarce. The mathematical beauty hidden in calypso rhythms. The linguistic connections between patois and half a dozen colonial dialects. He'd thought everyone noticed such things. There's a war on, Mr. Hartwell. Your war, whether you acknowledge it or not. The men who drink in this pub, the community you've built, they're all at risk if we fail. Samuel looked around the Crown and Anchor at 23 years of careful construction. His sanctuary, his identity, his life. What are you asking me to do? The stranger smiled, and suddenly Samuel knew exactly who he was looking at. I'm asking you to become your father's son. The recognition hit Samuel like a physical blow. Those piercing blue eyes, that distinctive jaw, the way he held his cigar. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister himself, sat across from him in a Bermondsey pub at midnight, asking him to abandon everything he'd built for a father he'd never truly known. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for the bar rail, steadying himself against the weight of revelation. You're asking me to throw away 23 years. Everything I've worked for, everything I am. Churchill's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. I'm asking you to discover what you've always been, Thomas's boy. What you were born to be. Born to be? Samuel's voice cracked with bitter laughter. I was born to be nothing in this country, a colonial subject whose best hope was invisible survival. You think I chose to hide my education, my abilities? You think I wanted to spend my life pretending to be less than I am? The words poured out like water through a broken dam. Decades of suppressed frustration and carefully concealed intelligence. Samuel had trained himself to speak in broken English, to lower his eyes when white customers occasionally stumbled into his pub, to make himself small and unthreatening. The performance had become second nature, protection against a world that had no place for an educated black man who dared to claim dignity. I know exactly what I sacrificed, Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. I read Chaucer at Cambridge, spoke Latin and Greek, studied mathematics that would make your Oxford boys weep. But none of that matters when your skin marks you as other, when intelligence in a black man is seen as threat rather than gift. Churchill leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "And what if I told you that this work, your father's work, the work I'm offering you, could change that, not just for you, but for every man who's ever sought refuge in this pub?" Samuel turned away, unable to bear the weight of hope in the Prime Minister's words. Through the blacked-out windows he could hear London stirring back to life, his London, the city that had grudgingly given him space to exist if he remained carefully invisible. His customers would return tomorrow evening, seeking the same comfort and acceptance they'd found for 23 years. They trusted him to maintain this sanctuary, to keep them safe in a world that barely tolerated their presence. "Marcus has a wife waiting in Barbados," Samuel said quietly. "Been saving for 3 years to bring her over. Clement sends half his wages home to his mother every month. Joseph," he paused, remembering the young man's eager questions about starting a family in London. "They depend on this place, on knowing it will be here unchanged when the world gets too hard to bear. And if Germany wins this war?" Churchill's voice was gentle but implacable. "What becomes of your sanctuary then? What happens to Marcus's wife, Clement's mother, Joseph's dreams when fascism takes root in British soil?" The question struck at Samuel's deepest fears. He'd seen the notices posted in shop windows, the subtle changes in attitude when food rationing made scapegoats necessary. The tolerance that allowed the Crown and Anchor to exist was fragile at best, dependent on Britain's desperate need for dock workers and factory hands. In a conquered England, men like his customers would become expendable, or worse. But the alternative Churchill offered terrified him just as much. Samuel stared at the documents spread across his bar, evidence of a father who'd lived and died in shadows, whose brilliant mind had been consumed by secrets that ultimately killed him. Was this his inheritance? A legacy of deception and danger disguised as duty? "I see the fear in your eyes," Churchill said softly. "It's the same look your father wore when we first approached him. He was afraid too, Samuel, afraid of what he might discover about himself, about what he was capable of. But he chose to act anyway, because the alternative was unconscionable." Samuel picked up the photograph again, studying his father's face with new understanding. The man he'd idolized as a simple carpenter had been something far more complex, a brilliant mind hidden behind colonial prejudices, using his gifts to serve a country that barely acknowledged his humanity. The parallels to his own life were devastating and undeniable. "If I do this," Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if I step into this world you're offering, what guarantee do I have that I'll survive it? That any of us will?" Churchill's smile was sad but honest. "None whatsoever. This war consumes everything it touches, Samuel, but I can promise you this. If you choose to act, if you embrace your father's legacy, you'll face whatever comes as the man you truly are, not the diminished version you've been forced to play." Samuel looked around the Crown and Anchor one more time, seeing it now not as a refuge, but as a beautiful prison of his own construction. The choice before him was impossible. Safety or truth, certainty or possibility, the life he'd built or the man he might become. His father's eyes seemed to watch him from the photograph, patient and proud, waiting for his answer. Samuel set the photograph down with deliberate care, his father's face now fixed in his memory like a map to uncharted territory. The weight of the decision pressed against his chest, but beneath the fear, something else stirred, a recognition he'd spent 23 years refusing to acknowledge. "What would I need to do?" The words emerged before he'd consciously decided to speak them, as if some deeper part of himself had already chosen. Churchill's eyes brightened with quiet satisfaction. "First, you'll need to learn the truth about how your father died. His final assignment involved intercepting German communications through Caribbean shipping networks. Someone betrayed him, someone who's still operating in London. Finding them is your first task." Samuel's hands moved automatically, collecting the scattered documents from the bar. The official seals and coded correspondence felt foreign beneath his fingers, artifacts from a world he'd never imagined entering. "And my pub? My customers?" "The Crown and Anchor becomes your cover," Churchill replied. "Caribbean dock workers see everything, which ships carry unusual cargo, which crews behave strangely, which conversations stop when the wrong person approaches. Your establishment is perfectly positioned to gather intelligence from the very community our enemies believe beneath notice. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel. The invisibility he'd cultivated as protection would now become his greatest asset. He thought of Marcus's detailed knowledge of shipping schedules, Clement's sharp eye for suspicious cargo, Joseph's connections throughout London's Caribbean community. His friends weren't just dock workers. They were witnesses to patterns that trained intelligence officers might miss entirely. "There's a briefcase in the cellar of St. Mark's Church," Churchill continued, producing a small brass key. "Your father hid it there before his final mission. The parish records will show you as having permission to retrieve personal effects. Inside, you'll find everything you need to begin." Samuel accepted the key, its weight surprising him. Such a small thing to unlock such enormous consequences. And if I discover if I can't do what he did? Then you return here, pour drinks, and pretend this conversation never happened. Churchill's voice carried no judgment, only understanding. "But I don't believe that will be necessary. Your father's gift didn't die with him, Samuel. It's been waiting in you all these years, patient as deep water." The phrase resonated strangely, awakening memories Samuel had forgotten. His father teaching him to see patterns in wood grain, to hear the mathematical relationships in steel drum music, to understand that intelligence took countless forms beyond what colonial schools recognized. Thomas Hartwell had been preparing his son for this moment long before either of them knew it. Samuel walked to the pub's front window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Through the blackout curtains, he could sense rather than see his neighborhood, the narrow streets where Caribbean families had built quiet lives, the docks where honest men labored under suspicious eyes, the delicate ecosystem of survival he'd helped nurture, all of it vulnerable to forces beyond their control. "My mother," he said suddenly. "Did she know?" "She knew enough. Your father's death devastated her, but she understood the necessity of silence. She protected you the only way she could, by letting you believe he was safely buried in Jamaica rather than dangerously alive in London." Another foundation cracked and shifted. Samuel had built his adult life on the myth of his father's peaceful death in Kingston, finding comfort in imagining Thomas Hartwell laid to rest in familiar soil, surrounded by people who understood him. The truth was harsher. A brilliant man dying alone in a foreign city, his sacrifice unacknowledged, his son deliberately kept ignorant of his fate. "When do I start?" Churchill smiled, recognizing the commitment in Samuel's voice. "Tonight. The Germans are planning something significant. Our intercepts suggest a major operation within the month. Your father was close to identifying their network when he was killed. His notes may contain the key to stopping them." Samuel turned from the window, his decision crystallizing with each word. The comfortable predictability of his pub owner's existence was already receding, replaced by something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. For the first time in decades, he felt the full weight of his intelligence, his education, his carefully suppressed capabilities stirring to life. "I'll need to tell my customers something. They'll notice changes. Tell them you're expanding your services, that you want to help the community stay informed about the war effort. It's not entirely untrue." Churchill rose, gathering his coat and hat. "A contact will approach you tomorrow evening during regular hours. A woman named Margaret Thornfield. She was your father's partner." Samuel nodded, committing the name to memory along with everything else that would define his new reality. The Crown and Anchor looked different now. Not an ending but a beginning, not a hiding place but a launching point into the dangerous unknown. Churchill paused at the door, his expression grave with the weight of what he was asking. "There's no shame in changing your mind, Samuel. This path cost your father everything." Samuel looked once more at the photograph, his father's intelligent eyes seeming to offer both warning and encouragement. "Then I'll have to be smarter than he was." The Prime Minister's smile was proud and sad as he disappeared into the London fog, leaving Samuel alone with his choice and its consequences. Samuel stood motionless in the empty pub for several minutes after Churchill's departure, the silence settling around him like dust after an explosion. The familiar comfort of the Crown and Anchor felt suddenly foreign. The worn wooden bar where he'd served thousands of pints, the mismatched chairs his customers had claimed as their own, the faded photographs of Caribbean islands that had adorned his walls for decades. Everything looked the same, Yet everything had changed irrevocably. He moved through his nightly routine with mechanical precision, washing glasses and wiping tables while his mind churned through the implications of what he'd agreed to. By dawn, he would no longer be simply Samuel Hartwell, publican and invisible man. He would be Thomas Hartwell's son, carrying forward a legacy he'd never known existed. The next evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, drawing larger crowds than usual to the Crown and Anchor. Samuel found himself studying his customers with new eyes, noting details he'd previously filed away unconsciously. Marcus describing unusual security around the German shipping berths. Clement mentioning foreign sailors who spoke in hushed tones and paid for drinks with pristine banknotes. Joseph recounting conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached certain dock supervisors. Intelligence. It had been flowing through his pub for years, disguised as gossip and complaints. "You seem different tonight, Samuel," Marcus observed, accepting his usual pint of mild bitter. "More attentive." Samuel forced a smile, testing the cover story Churchill had provided. "Been thinking about expanding what we offer here, maybe keeping better track of news, helping folks understand what's happening with the war effort." "Information service?" Clement laughed, but his eyes showed interest. "Might be useful, that. Hard to know what's truth and what's government propaganda these days." At precisely 8:30, a woman entered alone, unusual enough in itself to draw attention. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, dressed in the practical wool coat and modest hat of a government clerk, but Samuel noticed the way she assessed the room's exits and the careful positioning of her handbag for quick access. Margaret Thornfield moved like someone accustomed to dangerous spaces. She approached the bar with confident steps, her accent crisp and educated when she spoke. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Hartwell? I'm Margaret Thornfield from the Ministry of Information. I believe Mr. Churchill mentioned I might call." Several conversations paused at the mention of the Prime Minister's name. Samuel felt the weight of his customer's attention as he nodded professionally. "Of course, Miss Thornfield. Perhaps we could speak privately?" He led her to a small table in the corner, noting how she positioned herself to observe both the front door and the back exit. Whatever his father's partner had experienced, it had taught her to never feel trapped. "Your father spoke of you often," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the pub's gentle murmur. "He was proud of your intelligence, worried about your safety. He would have been pleased to know you chose to continue his work. Churchill said you were his partner. What did that mean exactly?" Margaret's smile carried old grief. Thomas was the pattern reader, the genius who could see connections others missed. I was the operator, the one who moved through dangerous spaces to gather the information he analyzed. We worked together for 6 years before. She didn't finish the sentence, but Samuel heard the weight of loss in her silence. Another piece of his father's hidden life came into focus. Not just a brilliant mind working in isolation, but a man who'd inspired loyalty, perhaps even love, among those who knew his true nature. "What happened to him?" Samuel asked, needing to understand the risks he was accepting. "He discovered that German intelligence had placed someone high in our Caribbean operations. Someone with access to shipping schedules, crew manifests, cargo documentation. Thomas was close to identifying them when he was murdered, made to look like a street robbery gone wrong." Samuel's hands tightened around his glass. His father hadn't died serving his country in some abstract sense. He'd been killed by an enemy who'd recognized the threat his brilliance posed. "The killer is still active," Margaret continued. "Still passing information to German U-boats, still costing Allied lives. Your father's final notes contain clues to their identity, but the codes are his own design. We've never been able to break them. And you think I can. You're his son. You share his linguistic gifts, his pattern recognition abilities. If anyone can unlock what Thomas discovered, it's you." Samuel looked around his pub, seeing his customers through new eyes once again. They weren't just friends seeking refuge. They were potential assets in a war that touched every aspect of their lives. Marcus's knowledge of dock security, Clement's observations about foreign sailors, Joseph's connections throughout London's Caribbean community, all of it valuable, all of it dangerous. "When do I see my father's notes?" Margaret smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Tomorrow morning. St. Mark's Church, as Churchill explained. But Samuel, her voice carried a warning. Once you read what your father discovered, there's no returning to ignorance. The enemy will recognize you as a threat, just as they did him. Samuel nodded, understanding that his transformation from publican to intelligence operative was already irreversible. His father's legacy was calling, and he would answer. Samuel barely slept that night. He lay in the narrow bed above the Crown and Anchor, staring at the ceiling while London's distant sounds filtered through his window. The occasional rumble of late transport trucks, the echo of footsteps on wet pavement, the soft wail of air raid sirens testing their readiness. Each sound seemed amplified, pregnant with significance he'd never noticed before. When dawn finally broke gray and reluctant over Bermondsey, he rose with the weight of anticipation pressing against his chest. Today he would read his father's final words, unlock secrets that had cost a brilliant man his life. The brass key felt warm in his pocket, worn smooth by nervous fingers throughout the sleepless hours. St. Mark's Church sat 3 streets away, its Gothic spire rising above the cramped terraced houses like a stone prayer made manifest. Samuel had passed it countless times without ever entering, content to let his neighbors practice their Anglican faith while he maintained his careful distance from institutions that might examine him too closely. Now its weathered doors represented a threshold he couldn't retreat from crossing. The interior smelled of old wood and uncertain hope, morning light filtering weakly through stained glass windows that had somehow survived the Blitz intact. Father Whitmore emerged from the vestry, a thin man in his 60s whose gentle demeanor suggested long practice at offering comfort to the desperate. Mr. Hartwell? Yes, I have the documentation regarding your father's effects. Terribly sorry for your loss, though I understand it happened some years ago. Samuel nodded, accepting the fiction that protected darker truths. Family circumstances made it impossible to retrieve his belongings earlier. The war has clarified certain priorities. The priest led him down stone steps into the church's crypt, where ancient tombs shared space with more practical storage. Wooden crates lined the walls, parish records, communion silver hidden from potential bombing, the accumulated detritus of centuries of worship. Father Whitmore indicated a particular section near the back wall. Your father's case should be just there, behind the 1847 baptismal records. Please, take whatever time you require. I'll be upstairs if you need assistance. Samuel waited until the priest's footsteps faded before approaching the hiding place. His hands trembled slightly as he moved the heavy record books, revealing a leather briefcase that looked remarkably ordinary for something containing such explosive secrets. The brass key turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment. Inside, Thomas Hartwell's final legacy lay organized with meticulous care. Photographs of dock workers and shipping officials, their faces unknown but somehow familiar, coded documents covered in his father's precise handwriting, mathematical symbols interwoven with what appeared to be fragments of various Caribbean languages, maps of London's river systems marked with cryptic annotations, and beneath it all, a letter addressed simply to my son. Samuel lifted the envelope with reverent care, his father's careful script swimming before eyes that had inherited the same analytical precision. The paper was thick, expensive. Thomas Hartwell had chosen his final communication with deliberate significance. Samuel, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded as I feared they might. The work Margaret and I have undertaken has revealed a rot at the heart of Britain's Caribbean intelligence network. Someone we trusted has been selling our people's lives to German submarines, turning their labor and sacrifice into targets for enemy torpedoes. I have hidden the evidence of their identity in these codes, using patterns you will recognize from our childhood games. Remember how we found mathematics in steel drum rhythms? How we decoded the grammar hidden in wood grain patterns? The same principles apply here, but the stakes are infinitely higher. You must know that I have watched your intelligence bloom from afar, even as circumstances forced you to hide your gifts behind broken English and humble service. The mind that impressed Cambridge professors still burns within you, waiting for purpose worthy of its capabilities. That purpose has now arrived. Trust Margaret, trust Churchill, but trust yourself most of all. You are Thomas Hartwell's son, but you must become something more, something I never had the courage to be. Not just a brilliant mind serving in shadows, but a man who stands openly in his power, regardless of the world's expectations. The enemy will recognize you once you begin this work. They will try to destroy you as they destroyed me. But you have advantages I lacked: community, loyalty, the deep trust of men who have tested your character through 23 years of honest friendship. Use those bonds. Let them become your strength rather than your weakness. I am proud of the man you have become, and proud of the man you will choose to be. Your father, Thomas Hartwell. Samuel read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, his father's voice echoing in every carefully chosen word. The coded documents suddenly looked less intimidating. Puzzles waiting to yield their secrets to someone who had learned pattern recognition at Thomas Hartwell's knee, even without knowing the deeper purpose of those childhood lessons. He gathered the materials carefully, understanding that his true preparation was just beginning. Tomorrow evening, Margaret would return to the Crown and Anchor, expecting progress. His customers would be watching for signs of the changes he'd promised. The enemy would be continuing their deadly work, unaware that Thomas Hartwell's son had finally stepped out of hiding. The game, as his father had taught him long ago, was all about seeing patterns others missed. Now Samuel would discover if he possessed the courage to act on what he found. Samuel spread his father's coded documents across the pub's backroom table like a general planning a campaign, but the familiar patterns that should have emerged remained stubbornly opaque. 3 days had passed since Margaret's visit, 3 nights of sleepless analysis that yielded nothing but mounting frustration and the growing certainty that he was failing his father's legacy before he'd properly begun. The mathematical sequences looked tantalizingly familiar, echoes of the childhood games Thomas Hartwell had played with wood grain and steel drum rhythms. But the key that would unlock their meaning remained hidden. Samuel had tried every permutation he could remember, every pattern recognition technique his father had taught him, yet the codes held their secrets with maddening persistence. Worse, his customers had begun to notice his distraction. Marcus had questioned him twice about the information service he'd promised to provide. Clement made pointed observations about Samuel's bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. Even steady, reliable Joseph seemed to be watching him with new wariness, as if sensing danger without understanding its source. The front door's bell chimed with unusual sharpness, cutting through Samuel's concentration like a blade. He quickly gathered the documents, shoving them into the briefcase as heavy footsteps approached the back room. When the door opened without invitation, Samuel found himself facing 2 men he'd never seen before, one tall and pale with the bearing of a military officer, the other shorter and darker with eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Hartwell?" The tall man's accent carried the crisp authority of Whitehall. "Inspector Davies, Metropolitan Police. This is Detective Constable Morrison. We'd like a word about some irregularities in your establishment." Samuel's blood turned to ice water. His father's warning echoed in his memory. The enemy will recognize you once you begin this work. But surely it was too soon. He hadn't discovered anything yet, hadn't made contact with any networks or gathered any intelligence worth killing for. Irregularities? Samuel let his voice slip into the broken English he'd perfected over decades, his Cambridge education sliding beneath a mask of humble confusion. "I run honest pub, Inspector. No trouble here." Detective Constable Morrison circled the room with predatory patience, noting the recently disturbed dust on the table, the slight disarray that suggested hidden materials hastily concealed. "Funny thing, Mr. Hartwell, we've had reports about unusual activities. Late-night visitors, hushed conversations, people asking questions about shipping schedules and dock security." The second man's voice carried a faint accent Samuel couldn't place. European, possibly German, carefully disguised beneath London inflections. Fear crystallized into cold certainty. These weren't police officers investigating routine matters. They were hunters, and somehow they'd identified him as prey. "My customers work at docks," Samuel said carefully. "They talk about work, same as anyone. Nothing unusual in that." Inspector Davies smiled with reptilian warmth. "Of course not. But we're also investigating some irregularities regarding your father's effects. Seems someone recently accessed materials that were supposed to remain undisturbed. Church records show a Thomas Hartwell briefcase was collected 3 days ago." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained carefully neutral. His father had prepared for this possibility. The briefcase hidden in his bedroom upstairs contained decoy documents, meaningless papers designed to satisfy a cursory search. The real codes were memorized, burned into his consciousness during 3 days of intensive study. "My father died years ago," Samuel replied. "Just collecting personal things, finally had time to deal with old business." Morrison moved closer, close enough that Samuel could smell cigarettes and something else. Gun oil, metal polish, the scent of violence professionally maintained. "Mind if we have a look around? Just routine, you understand. Making sure everything's properly documented." It wasn't a request. Samuel nodded slowly, leading them upstairs while his mind raced through possibilities. The decoy briefcase would satisfy them temporarily, but how long before they realized the documents were meaningless? How long before they decided he knew more than he was revealing? In his modest bedroom, Samuel retrieved the false briefcase with steady hands, watching their faces as they examined the carefully prepared forgeries. Davies seemed satisfied, but Morrison's expression suggested deeper suspicion, the instincts of a man accustomed to elaborate deceptions. "These are just personal papers," Davies concluded after several minutes. "Family photographs, old correspondence, nothing of interest to our investigation." But Morrison continued studying Samuel with uncomfortable intensity. "You seem nervous, Mr. Hartwell. Anything else you'd like to tell us about your father's activities? Any other materials he might have left behind?" The moment crystallized around Samuel like fate taking visible form. He could continue hiding, pretending ignorance, letting them leave with their false evidence while he abandoned his father's mission. Or he could step forward into the dangerous unknown, accepting the risk that came with his birthright. "No other materials," he said quietly, meeting Morrison's stare with steady resolve. "Nothing else at all." The lie felt like a declaration of war. The lie felt like a declaration of war, but Samuel hadn't anticipated how quickly that war would turn against him. Morrison's eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of a predator sensing weakness. "Interesting," he murmured, stepping closer until Samuel could see the pale scar running along his jawline, a mark that spoke of violence survived and lessons learned. "Because we have reason to believe your father was involved in activities that extended well beyond personal correspondence." Samuel's mouth went dry. The memorized code suddenly felt like burning brands in his consciousness. Thomas Hartwell's mathematical sequences threatening to spill from his lips under the weight of Morrison's scrutiny. He forced his expression to remain blank, clinging to the protective mask of ignorance even as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Don't know nothing about that," he managed, his voice roughening with manufactured confusion. "Papa, he just worked odd jobs, kept to himself mostly." Davies had been examining the room with methodical precision, running his fingers along the windowsill, checking behind the modest bureau, studying the floorboards for signs of disturbance. Now he straightened with the air of a man reaching uncomfortable conclusions. "Mr. Hartwell, we're going to need you to come with us for additional questioning. Just routine follow-up, you understand. Make sure we have all the details properly documented." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. They were taking him, removing him from the Crown and Anchor, from his customers, from the only life he'd built in 23 years of careful construction. Worse, they were doing it in full view of the pub below, where Marcus and Clement would witness their friend being led away by authorities who moved with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to making people disappear. "I got business to run," Samuel protested weakly, but even he could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. "Customers depending on me." Morrison's smile carried genuine amusement. "I'm sure your customers will understand. Community-minded folks like them, they wouldn't want to interfere with official police business." The threat was unmistakable. Cooperate or watch the Crown and Anchor become a target for official harassment that would destroy everything Samuel had built. His customers weren't just friends. They were working men with families, vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic persecution that could shatter their lives with bureaucratic precision. As they descended the narrow stairs, Samuel saw his worst fears materializing. The entire pub had fallen silent, 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the tableau of their trusted friend being escorted by men whose authority carried the stench of something rotten. Marcus half rose from his chair, concern warring with caution across his weathered features. Clement's hands had closed into fists, but he remained seated, recognizing the futility of challenging forces beyond their reach. "Nothing to worry about, gentlemen," Davies announced with false joviality. "Just need Mr. Hartwell to clarify a few administrative matters. He'll be back soon enough." But Joseph's eyes met Samuel's across the room, and in that brief connection, Samuel saw terrible understanding. His friend had recognized something in Davies and Morrison that others might miss, the particular brand of menace that came from men who operated outside normal constraints, who could make problems disappear without troubling themselves over legal niceties. At the pub's entrance, Samuel turned for what might be his final look at the Crown and Anchor. The brass fittings gleamed in the afternoon light, worn smooth by decades of honest use. His customers' faces blurred together. Men who had trusted him with their stories, their fears, their friendship. Men who would now question everything they thought they knew about Samuel Hartwell. "Touching," Morrison observed, following his gaze. "Amazing how attached people get to places, isn't it? Particularly when those places represent their entire life's work." The implication crystallized with horrible clarity. They weren't just taking him for questioning. They were demonstrating their power to destroy everything he cared about. The Crown and Anchor, his customers' trust, his carefully constructed identity, all of it balanced on the edge of obliteration, contingent on his continued cooperation with their agenda. As the black sedan pulled away from Bermondsey's familiar streets, Samuel watched his world shrink in the rear window until it vanished entirely. His father's codes burned in his memory like accusations, brilliant patterns he'd been too slow to decode, secrets that might have saved lives if only he'd possessed Thomas Hartwell's genius instead of merely inheriting his stubborn pride. The enemy had found him before he'd found them. Whatever network had murdered his father now held Samuel's life in their hands, along with the lives of everyone who'd made the mistake of trusting him. Margaret would arrive tonight expecting progress and find an empty pub. Churchill would wait for intelligence that would never come. Samuel closed his eyes and felt his father's legacy crumbling to ash between his fingers, taking 23 years of honest friendship down with it into the gathering darkness of a London afternoon that might be his last as a free man.